Well, good evening. Hope you've had a good day today. Might have to change the title of this from Meet at the Table to Meet at the Fire Pit, but I just really wanted to kind of come across as being informal, maybe come across as just a bunch of men sitting around a fire pit just shooting the breeze. And so that's kind of the way that I want this to come across. Don't want it to come across like I'm preaching at you or anything else, but just want to give you some help. And so here tonight, I didn't do this last week, just wasn't able to, but here tonight, I want to share with you, here's our topic, and that is, can a man be manly and be spiritual at the same time? And I'm going to answer that with a verse of Scripture. 1 Corinthians 16:13 says this. It says, be watchful, be firm in the faith, act like men, and be strong. And so if you break that down, you know, what do we have? We have four parts. The first part is be watchful. You can look at that as far as spiritually or physically. I think with us men, you know, we're going to probably look at that physically. For me, I'm going to probably look at it at the very beginning. I'm going to look at it physically because, you know, as far as being a man and being a protector of your family, you want to be watchful. One of the things that we do, we go in a restaurant to sit down and eat. My wife already knows, my wife and my son knows that I'm going to be sitting facing the door. I'm going to know who's coming in. I'm going to know who's coming out. If we're in a parking lot and we're, you know, heading to the car, we're heading, you know, into a shopping mall, heading into Concord Mills, something like that, maybe a movie theater, you know, I'm constantly looking. I'm not being paranoid. I'm just being safe. You know, constantly looking, being watchful, you know, making sure that there is no threats, just being a protector, trying to keep my family safe. And so, you know, being watchful, we will look at that as far as physical. You could also look at it as far as spiritual, because we're to be watchful as far as in the faith as well. Be firm in the faith, well, that's obvious. You know, we're looking at the spiritual side there. You know, act like men. I'll come back to that one here in just a minute. You know, be strong. Be strong, again, you can look at it both physically and spiritually. Again, I think with us men, we would immediately think about the physical on that. You know, we would think about, do you have a 4-plate deadlift? Do you have a 3-plate squat? Do you have a 2-plate bench press? I mean, that's kind of where our mind would probably go. You know, do you have some boxing? Do you have some wrestling or jiu-jitsu or, you know, whatever the case might be? You know, we would immediately start thinking like that. You know, am I physically strong? Am I physically capable? And just like 2 weeks ago, you know, I shared with you, and that is, are you capable of violence? As a biblical man, we need to be capable of violence. Now, it is to be restrained. You know, you don't want to just go off half-cocked on anybody for anything. But if trouble comes your way, then yes, you ought to be capable of violence. And so, just the three things that I give you on that, as far as being watchful, be firm in the faith, and then be strong. I think it's obvious that, yes, we can be manly and be spiritual. And may I say this, it's our God-given responsibility. We honor God when we are both manly and spiritual. Paul was writing to Timothy, I think it's in 1 Timothy chapter 4, and he said, you know, a man that won't provide, all right? So a man's to be a provider, be a protector. A man that won't provide, protect for his family is worse than an infidel, and he's denied the faith. And so, you know, we ought to be, you know, again, we ought to be strong. We ought to be firm in the faith. We ought to be watchful. You know, again, act like men. We have a God-given responsibility to be both manly and be spiritual. And I say that here tonight because, and this is really just a kind of an introduction to this. I'll probably start breaking it down, go a little bit deeper just each week, not spend that much time on any of these things, kind of keep these things short, try to keep them about 10 minutes. But I say that because for the most part, the church has done grave injustice to men. Hate to say it, but in a lot of ways, the church is not men friendly. You know, you look at a lot of churches today, and I'm not saying this in a bad way. You know, not trying to be anti-woman or anything with what I'm getting ready to say, but when you look at the church today, it's sad. The man is to be a leader. He's to be a provider. He's to be a protector. Well, if he's going to be that, he's to be a leader. He is to be the head. But when you look at a lot of churches today, they're run by women. When you look at a lot of churches today, you hear the statement, well, we got to do what she wants, or we've got to make her happy. I'm like, well, that's the problem. We've got this thing so reversed that when the man is no longer able to lead, and it's the woman that leads, and, it's the woman that you got to keep happy with everything, then no wonder we're in the mess we're in. God can't bless that, because that's not the order in which God designed things. Not wanting to go too far into this, but God he created man first. He did not create Eve first. He created Adam first. And so Adam had the headship. Adam had the responsibility. The law was not given to Eve. The law was given to Adam. Adam was to be the head. Adam was to teach. Adam was to help. Adam was to protect his wife, and he failed to do that. And again, that's another story. But when you look at it today, for the most part, our churches today are ran by women. It should not be that way. The woman is very useful. She is to be a helpmate. She is to be an encourager. Yes, she can serve. She can do all these things. I'm not saying that. But as far as the leadership role, it should be the man. And we see that even in society. We see that with the White House. We see that with the Faith Advisory board that Trump has there. Well, who is heading that up? A woman is heading that up. I'm like, no, that should not be. Where is the men at? The men are not standing up and being men, taking the lead, taking the initiative, setting the example. And so, again, the church is not man-friendly, right? The church is not man-friendly. And here's another one. When you look today, as far as a lot of the teaching in the church, the turn the other cheek, love your enemies, and then one of the ones that I'm going to touch just a little bit here tonight is, it's in Romans chapter 12. It's the last part of that chapter, and it goes through, avenge not yourselves, basically let God take care of this, render not evil for evil, all that. And I'm like, here's the thing. We have basically taken a lot of this stuff out of context, and I think it was done on design because people wanted, and especially government stuff, they wanted a quiet church. They did not want an outspoken church. They didn't want a militant church. They wanted a very passive church that would fall in line, do what they were told, not cause a stink, not, stand up for anything, not stand against anything. And so that's kind of what they wanted. And so I think that the perversion of a lot of them passages were on design. But what is it really talking about? It's basically talking about faith, not fight. And you say, well, what do you mean by that? All right. Well, here it is. Avenge not yourselves. It is talking about my defense of the faith. If people is attacking me for my faith, I'm going to let God handle that. All right. That's when it comes to faith. All right. I'm going to let God handle that, and God will handle that. But when it comes to fight, all right, if somebody is attacking my family, it's a physical altercation. My life is on the line. My family's life is on the line. My friend's life is on the line. That's not what that's talking about. In that case, then you're a David, okay? When David was handling Saul, he said, I'm going to let God take care of this. But when David was standing against Goliath, yes, he still let God take care of it, but David was willing to fight there, right? He's not. And David rendered good for evil. And I know a lot of times today, people will take, and I'm almost going to have this done. My neighbor up the hill has gotten the mower going. But a lot of times today, the church looks and, they take everything. If you stand up, if you fight back, if you push back, they're like, well, you're rendering evil for evil. No, I'm not. Let me explain it like this, all right? if somebody is attacking my family, if somebody comes against my wife or comes against my son to cause them bodily harm, and what am I going to do? All right, I'm going to protect my wife. I'm going to protect my son. In protecting them, if the one that is causing the problem, right? If the one that is attacking them, if the one that's trying to hurt them, in protecting them, if that person, if their life is ended or they are maybe severely maimed, whatever the case might be, you know, I did not render evil for evil. I rendered good for evil. Because the only way that you stop evil is by good. And sometimes good is not turning the other cheek and walking away. Sometimes good is addressing the problem. You know, God would, again, when the Bible says avenge not yourselves, it's talking about the faith, right? If somebody's attacking me, saying derogatory things about me or whatever the case might be, you know, because of me being a Christian, me being a pastor, you know, about the faith, I'm not worried about that, right? Let God handle that. No weapon formed against us shall prosper. Every tongue that arises against us in judgment thou shalt condemn. Let God handle that. But when it comes to protecting my own, and when it comes to protecting my family, and when it comes to standing up and being a man and, you know, fighting back against corruption, fighting back against evil, yes, I'm going to depend upon God because I need His strength. But I'm also not going to stay silent. Because if I'm staying silent, then I'm not being the man that God would have me to be. Because God did not put us here to be weak. God put us here to be warriors. That's how He designed us as men. You see it even with, and I wish we could get back to this, but you see it even with, you know, young boys on the playground. I remember when I was growing up, young boys on the playground, man, we was wrestling, we was horse playing, you know, and nobody said anything. As long as it stayed in check and we didn't get to throwing punches and stuff, it was no big deal. That was just boys being boys. That's the way God made us. God made us rough and tumble. God made us to be warriors. God made us to be fighters, you know. And if we did get out of hand and we started slinging punches, then, you know, for the most part, you wasn't suspended or any of the things that happens today. It was, you know, they broke it up and, all right, now y'all shake hands. And, you know, we would begrudgingly shake hands and, you know, then usually we ended up and become good friends, sometimes best of friends. I'll just be honest with you. I'm getting ready to wrap this thing up, but I think we need to get back to that because if more bullies got punched in the mouth, you'd have less bullies in our school system today. And that's just my opinion, and you could disagree with that if you want to, but there it is. And so here tonight, all right, can we be manly and be spiritual? Absolutely. Absolutely. And we ought to be, because being, as a man, being manly and spiritual is honoring God. And so I'm going to continue with this. I'm just going to kind of stop it right there, let you think about these things, all right? Think about how we have been quieted a lot by the church. And then, Lord willing, I'll just kind of pick up with this next week, Monday, all right? Monday night, I'll pick up with this. I'm not going to wait till Thursday. Next Monday evening, Lord willing, I'll pick up with this and go a little bit farther. But I hope you have a good night. And listen, men, you can be manly and you can be spiritual at the same time. Joby Martin said these words. I follow him on Instagram. He said, men, when you choose to follow Christ, you do not have to leave your testicles at the door. And that is true, all right? We can be a biblical man. As a matter of fact, God would have us to be a biblical man. So let's stand up. Let's act like men. Let's be strong. Let's be watchful. And let's stand firm in the faith. Lord bless you. Have a good night.